It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon, and of course our speaker, Michael Pezzullo. He has the single honour of being the first speaker we've ever had a demonstration against him. Well, we can talk about that in due course. Mike's had a very distinguished public service career and as a political advisor, and as you know now is the Secretary of the Department of Immigration, Border Protection and so forth. And I think the department seems to be growing as we sit here and just wait. So he's got a lot to talk about, how the world is changing and how we need to protect various aspects of the way we live and so forth. And I think what he has been able to see over the last right through to now, and we were just discussing the problems of a country like Italy with Libya just across the sea and so forth. How do they deal with it and so forth? And the migration issues are very, very complicated, but rather than me try and sort of guess as what's going to happen next, I'll invite Mike Pezzullo to tell us. So.
Thank you, Greg. I certainly hope that my presence here didn't create any inconvenience for anyone. I'd like to address the idea of the nation and what is the nation in a globalised world. The Australian national story, in its European form, began, of course, in 1788. Within a century of settlement, Australia would become one of the richest nations on earth, largely thanks to wool, gold and other fruits of the land. We achieved nationhood by way of federation in 1901, of course, without war or strife. Over this period, we built the modern governance framework of our nation: parliamentary democracy, representative government, the rule of the common law, the structures of executive government, the practice of the freedom of speech, belief, faith and ideas. Australia's blessing in this period was to embark on this journey of nation building precisely at a time when, throughout the 19th century, people were pursuing what used to be termed, without any sense of irony, progress. It was often spelt in those days as a proper noun with a capital P. Regrettably, we don't speak or indeed write like that anymore. This was the first great age of global commerce and trade, when the telegraph line and the railway changed our very sense of time and speed, when the growth in commercial shipping made the world a smaller place, and when global markets were formed to power and finance the efficient trade of commodities and manufactured goods. During this time, the Europeans who settled the land had come to terms with a unique geography to which they were utterly unaccustomed. In recent years, we have started to better appreciate how well the Indigenous First Peoples of this nation had managed the land and the seas around it, with clear purpose and deep understanding, gained over countless generations. The early European settlers learned more from Indigenous land management than perhaps we today realise and recognise. And in this very tangible way, and in so many other ways, the Indigenous foundation of the national story needs to be better appreciated. And I'm sure that everyone in this room would be familiar with Geoffrey Blaney's recent scholarship, including his updated work on the triumph of the nomads, the story of Australia's people, Volume 1, The Rise and Fall of Ancient Australia, from which I gain that insight. As our forebears grappled with an unfamiliar land and built a nation, they created a cultural system of norms, codes of behaviour and language, including, of course, slang. A recognised sensibility was seared into our national character between European settlement and the terrible crucible of the Great War. Australians by that time, and for some decades before, knew and sensed that social acceptance and approval flowed from the simple traits of our national character. Do your job well, avoid pomposity and excessive deference, crack a joke and share a laugh, especially when things are not looking too flash. Be practical and utilitarian in your outlook. Give everyone a fair go, irrespective of social rank and standing, and help your mate. A decent way to live, one would have to say. Towards the end of the 19th century, Australians were starting to conceive of the establishment of a nation to embrace this settled and prosperous continent. Our Act of Federation on the 1st of January 1901 was, as some have suggested, largely a transactional compact concerned in the main with interstate trade and customs arrangements amongst the colonies, as well as its national defence. Certainly our constitution is not given to lyrical declarations and expressions of grand concepts concerned with the rights and liberties and their philosophical foundations, as are some others. It is, on the contrary, a very practical rulebook for governing Australia. As true as that might be, there was also in the lead up to federation a strong trend of idealistic nationalism, of being embarked on a grand journey of social improvement, whose aim was the building of a better and fairer society. The older Anglo-Australia that I've described above, and I use that term both descriptively and affectionately, has largely passed into memory. We retained for many decades very conscious links to Britain, its empire, and above all to England by way of our culture, customs and habits. That did start to change ever so slowly after the 1940s, as the very fabric of Australia began to change with the inauguration of the post-war immigration program and the gradual advent of a distinctive cultural and strategic outlook. But it took a generation or more of national evolution. I'm certainly old enough to recall when visiting Australian family friends, as we migrant families used to call them, in their homes in the 1970s, the sense of the imitation of England, and especially the English home and garden, more so even than the evocation of Britain. This came down to the simple things, like the crockery and the cutlery, and of course the tea sets, as well as the attitudes of mind and the habits of action. I know I'm certainly old enough to recall the tales of the Bodyline Ashes tour of 32-33 as told by those who had been there, or at least they said that they'd been there, and for whom Bodyline was a seared memory of a tragic clash within the family. Anglo-Australia entailed for many, I suspect, a love of two lands. So, as someone whose childhood was in the 60s and 70s, Australia certainly today looks and feels very different from what it once did then. And I don't think we should be overly nostalgic about this. Ours is not an ethnically based nationalism, which is based on ties of blood, race, monocultural origin and common religious observance. Irrespective of our ethnic origins, we should nonetheless recognise the thread of fraternity and association that we have with that older Australia and with those early settlers, as well as the farmers and the pastoralists, the miners, the stockmen, and those who built the colonial cities and the towns in which most of us live today. Without their labour and their commitment to the Australian project, we would be much diminished and impoverished. It is indeed the duty of every generation to build the nation. We should therefore celebrate the historical foundations of our nation. A nation is not an arbitrary geographical construct that happens to be inhabited at any one time by randomly selected individuals who lack any prior connections or common history. It is not a blank slate that can be completely remade every generation. The very idea of the nation implies continuities in terms of common identity, the durability and strength of institutions, as well as expectations of mutual trust and recognition and common allegiance. Nations indeed are biographies of a people, an intergenerational story flowing through time. And each of us carries a shared heritage, history and identity. Our national biography contains many chapters, some dating back thousands of years, some a few hundred, and some, of course, yet to be written. Now, Australians are not given to highly symbolic expressions of nationalism and the pomp and ceremony that is to be found in some other national cultures. Most pleasingly, our national culture is not reproduced in every generation on the basis of some deep historical enmity which is held against another people, and where the sorrows of long and violent grudges are ingrained into the collective consciousness and passed down from one generation to the next. Indeed, Australia's success as a multicultural society challenges the idea that citizens of a nation state have to share a singular identity that is grounded in a differentiator of race, creed or belief. Australians respect one another regardless of our cultural, racial, religious or other differences, and expect all to participate equitably in our society, with a full appreciation of the rights and responsibilities that come with membership of that society. Our nationalism, I would contend, is a civic compact, expressed as loyalty to the community that inhabits our nation state within its defined territorial limits and borders, and allegiance to the sovereignty of the people's will, as expressed through our public institutions of governance. Now, a nation, of course, is an imagined community. We will never know more than a handful of our fellow countrymen and women, or even hear of them, even with the spread of social media. But it is not an imaginary community. It is a real phenomenon with tangible features and material consequences. To prove the point, think about this. To say that you have no country and that you are a global citizen or a citizen of the world is to say that you inhabit a planetary home without territorial limits or borders. Well might you imagine living out a countercultural vision where there are no countries and all the people share all the world. But you would still have to deal with tricky dilemmas. Questions such as who provides you with consular protection when you are overseas? Well, I suppose as a global citizen, you are never overseas. Who provides your essential public services? Who collects your contribution to those services by way of taxes, fees and charges? And who protects you from criminal violence, amongst many other tricky questions? In short, membership of the national community is a real and tangible component of personal identity. Our status as a citizen cannot mean different things to different people depending on their personal self-constructed identity. You cannot construct your own citizenship experience so as to negate your status and duties as a citizen. That is why our Citizenship Pledge and Affirmation recognises allegiance to Australia and its people, our shared democratic beliefs, rights and liberties, and the observance of our laws. With every pledge of allegiance on the part of new citizens, an affirmation of allegiance on the part of existing citizens, our mutual bonds of national association are invoked, as is our national story, our cultural system of customs and norms, and the undertakings that we have made to one another, to our forebears and to our descendants. Now, against this backdrop, I would contend that not enough critical thinking is occurring in relation to the social consequences of globalisation, transnational mobility, and so-called borderless connectivity. What do I mean by this? With high levels of global mobility and increasing levels of temporary migration, the traditional models of social integration are being challenged around the world. In Australia, that I touched on earlier periods of isolation from family, friends and ethnic culture and language often compelled new migrants to integrate into their host societies. Consequently, I would contend that we managed to avoid the creation of a confederation of separate communities defined by race, religion or ethnicity. Certainly that was my personal experience growing up in the 60s and the 70s. In this age of globalisation and planetary connectivity, which is seeing the unmooring, I would contend, of communities from traditional cultural roots and points of reference, we could, if we're not careful, see the emergence of virtual transnational communities that are disengaged from their host societies and which are perhaps built around resurgent and indeed ancient bonds of race or religion or both. Perversely, in some parts of the world, globalisation and borderless connectivity seem to be exacerbating trends of fragmentation, isolation and disengagement. And indeed, social media and connectivity can be means to reinforce ancient exclusionary bonds and allegiance. And I would point in evidence of that contention to ISIS's use of social media and their information operations, which are, I have to say, of a very high quality. We are entitled to expect that those who come here to settle, to work, to study, will integrate into our community in terms of adhering to our values, respecting our laws and institutions, and exhibiting mutual respect towards one and all. We should be, I think, very confident of achieving this. We have a very strong foundation of social cohesion, well-supported multiculturalism, and a long tradition of orderly migration, which has typically enjoyed very high levels of public confidence and support. And arguably, as the Prime Minister says, we are one of the most successful multi-ethnic societies in human history, if not the most successful. My thesis today is that our national story, properly told in its many phases, episodes and anecdotes, and shorn of any chauvinism, is the essential foundational layer for the constant generation and regeneration of our national culture and our tangible material sense of community, which brings us together as a cohesive society. We should, in my view, more consciously reflect on our Indigenous heritage, our British social, political and economic foundations, and the vivid multicultural strands of our contemporary society. Let me turn and conclude these observations by going back to a remark I made earlier about how civic membership of the state affords us protection from criminal violence. And Greg, because I know that this forum likes a philosophical discussion, I think I'll end these reflections on indeed a philosophical reflection. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes, of course, wrote Leviathan. He set out the foundation of modern political philosophy, certainly in the Anglo world. We give to the sovereign, we yield to the sovereign the power of violence and ultimately the power to monopolise death in order to protect us from the war of all against all. Without which, of course, we would live in Hobbes's contention in continual fear of the danger of violent death ourselves. Lest we did that, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. Only 3 years earlier, in 1648, in the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War, a complementary notion of sovereignty emerged, that is to say that the sovereign also protects you from external military threats and protects, on the basis of the principle of territorial integrity, your state, the state in which you live. And so the dual notion of sovereignty emerged in the 17th century. Sovereignty in terms of protection against external threats, and sovereignty in terms of the monopolisation of violence within a society to protect us against criminal and other threats to life, liberty and our property. With the advent of globalisation that I touched on earlier, with the spreading networks of information, data connectivity, trade, travel, capital flows, which of course is leading to tremendous prosperity for the largest number of human beings in history, both in absolute and relative terms, and with the victory in recent decades of capitalism over communism, and the advent of a preference for market-based solutions in most areas of society and the economy, there is no doubt that globalisation is both here to stay and in net terms a positive human phenomenon. But it does carry with it a dark side. Criminal groups, terrorists, nihilists, anarchists and indeed state-linked actors can use those very networks to infiltrate our society. They can marshal resources that were previously out of reach. I could go on with a separate lecture here on the sorts of tools, techniques and capabilities that those groups can get access to. Encryption, which when I started my public service career 30 years ago was the sole preserve at the level of complexity that is now able to be accessed by non-state actors. Encryption, the sole preserve of the state until recently. Cyber tools, including those that accidentally get released onto the internet, that allow non-state actors to conduct hacking operations, to collect information, and indeed potentially through the deployment of their implants, damage and destroy property. The cyber world affords criminals a whole new realm of brokering. They can broker drugs, people, weapons. You can arrange for murder and assassinations through the so-called dark web. Cyber also affords criminal groups and other like groups a sophisticated masking of identity, which makes attribution and peeling back attribution very, very difficult indeed. It affords opportunities for extortion and ransom of businesses and indeed in some cases whole countries. Through the advent of cryptocurrency and new digital mediums, if not carefully regulated and managed, criminal enterprises and terrorist groups will be able to pay for goods and services in a completely unregulated fashion. And increasingly there appears to be evidence, and I just rely here solely on the unclassified literature, that criminal groups are trying to figure out ways to intercept financial transactions through interbank transfer systems. And most abhorrently, this is even very difficult to talk about, let alone research and indeed investigate, the advent of pay-for-view child exploitation practices, which are becoming more and more prevalent, especially regrettably through Asia. These and other trends challenge the very notion of the sovereign, and by sovereign I mean in the sense that Hobbes meant it, maintaining civil order within the territorial boundaries of the state and protecting externally the state from military attack versus an identified military force. There is a merging between the external zone, which traditionally were inhabited by state actors with military forces, and the internal zone, which is policed by the sovereign through the maintenance of civil order. There's a new grey zone emerging between the state of war on the one hand and the maintenance of civil order in peacetime on the other hand. There is emerging a dark universe where the monopoly of violence traditionally for 350 years, which is traditionally the preserve of the sovereign, and the monopoly on the use of coercive violence in order to maintain order is being challenged by actors who can, in some cases, rival and outwit the sovereign through cyberspace, in supply chains, through financial networks, and through their penetration of trade and travel systems. This trend needs to be very, very, very carefully analysed, thought about, and indeed acted upon. It challenges the very notion of the nation providing security and enforcing its laws. Thank you very much.